Miuli is a German illustrator and comic artist. Her artworks include a lot of character personality and expressiveness as well as storytelling. She also shares many helpful tips for artists on her Instagram. I'm amazed by her knowledge and way of portraying the elements in her art, so in today's video I want to share what I learned when analyzing her art. Hi, here's May and welcome to this art style analysis video. We'll go through different elements that make up Miuli's artworks and talk about them one at a time to simplify this art style study. I use the same basic framework for breaking down the art with different elements. I find this method makes the differences in the art styles I study more clear, since that way I can tell more easily what element particularly stands out for the artist I'm studying, for example. Since I also use the same elements when drawing myself, I'm able to apply the elements I like to my own art. Now let's start with the first element, the line art. Miuli uses varying line thickness and rather thin lines. The silhouette lines tend to be thicker than the fold or inner lines. Some shading or shapes can also be fully black. Often you have no shading. I'll talk more about this later on. So here it makes sense that the shadows are minimal and limited to the line art only. Some illustrations include shading as well though. The line art has black color. Some lines can be incomplete for folds and patterns. Next, let's talk about the bodies Miuli draws and how she portrays anatomy. The characters here tend to be around 7 to 8 heads tall. Miuli uses rather muscular, realistic proportions. They appear a bit cartoony, shapy, and stylized. The characters usually have a lot of tapering for the limbs, meaning the upper arm, for example, gets very thin towards the elbow. You can really see this in the thin wrists Miuli draws as well. Miuli also drew some proportion explorations, for example. Here you can really nicely see how changing the width of different body parts and how much muscle and fat mass characters have can change the look of the bodies. Some things I commonly saw for the bodies she draws would be that the elbows are often pointy and a lot of rounded shapes are used on the body, while the feet are rather small and flat. The hands for the characters Miuli draws are bigger with straight fingers and rounded defined knuckles. Male characters tend to have more blocky square hands, whereas female characters have more rounded, thinner ones. After talking more about the body, let's move on to a very important body part that can be very expressive, the head. We start with talking about the face shape. This in general is rather rounded, mostly for female characters a pointy chin, while for male characters a wider chin is drawn in. The face often has harsh changes of direction and the cheeks can look puffy at times. Male characters usually have a longer face shape, female ones a wider one with thinner cheeks. The change of direction from the cheek downwards to the chin inwards appears more clearly for male characters, while for female ones this disappears more often because of the more rounded face shape. Position-wise, this change of direction would be in between the eyes and ears for the three-quarter view. For a more frontal view of the face it would also be there or slightly lower at around the mouth level. Next is the nose. This can be portrayed through a line or nostrils. Usually there would also be a shadow or light on it as well. This can have a diamond, triangle or rounded shape and it's placed at the side of the nose or underneath it. Sometimes this shadow or light shape will be outlined as well. If you would define parts that the nose can be made up of, this would be a line, a nose bridge line, 1 or 2 nostrils, a shadow or light shape at the side nose, a shadow underneath the nose, a light on the nose bridge. In the side view, the nose is usually going pretty far forward and it's pointy. Next, let's talk about the mouth. This is portrayed using lines with varying line thickness and also a chin line or shadow underneath. At times the mouth is pretty far up on the face, like this the characters tend to have a bigger chin. The open mouths tend to be small often, sometimes small teeth are added to the mouth shape as well. These teeth can be outlined and in some cases small sharp side tents will be added as well. In a few cases the mouth has some empty space in between. Sometimes there also will be a small highlight added on the mouth. Lip gloss and small shading is added in a few cases as well. For smiling characters with their mouth open you often have just a completely white mouth for the inside, or also teeth, a tongue, and black space added for the inside of the mouth. Next, it's time for the eyebrows. These can be pretty different for each character. They can be rather thin or thicker and more curved or straight depending on the character. A outlined shape or just fully filled black line art can be used to portray them. The eyes would be a feature that can make every artist's art very unique and they're what I'll talk about next. Placement wise they tend to be around the middle of the head, slightly higher up than what I would usually use. We start with the outlines and shapes of the eye. This is what you would focus on during the sketching or line art phase mainly. The eyes have a round parallelogram almond-like shape. It would be made up of an inner, upper, lower and at times outer part. Not everything around the eye shape is outlined, usually the inner part and in some cases the outer one will not be lined. The upper eyelash is thicker than the lower one. As for lashes, there always will be the big one for the upper eyeline and sometimes 1 to 3 additional lines will be added as well. This can also be similar for the lower eyeline. The overall lines there tend to be a lot smaller. The lines to draw the eye are usually black. Next we move on to lines around the eye. Here you have one small line above the eyelash and sometimes more added lines to show the eye sockets. In a few cases longer or multiple lines that also change direction will be drawn in here as well. Next would be the iris and pupil. First of all, the iris has a circular rounded shape. The shading of the iris, if there is any, tends to be rather simple. Here would be one method I figured out to shade the iris like Miuli. First you have the base color, then you have a shadow for the upper part of the iris, and that would be it. I also saw one illustration where more detailed eye shading was used. For shading the eyes like this, I would also add in one layer for overlay lights and one layer for an outline of the pupil. Speaking of the pupil, this will usually be a slightly bigger circular shape within the iris. In some illustrations it's left out as well. To make the eyes look alive, adding highlights is important. They can be either at the side of the iris, at the top above the pupil, or at the side of the iris going into the white of the eye. Sometimes they are not added as well. The white of the eye will not be shaded, apart from a few cases with more detailed eye and general shading. After the eyes, let's finish up with the face by talking about the face shading. Around the eyes, the darkest shadow will be at the inner corner of the eye line. Some more shadows will be added to the upper side of the eye as well. Sometimes, like this, the part below the eye line is usually brighter than the part above it. Other than this, shading around the eyes, some blush on the cheeks will usually be added as well. This can include lines and red parts around the eye can be added in as well. The nose will also have a bit of blush in some cases. Often you just have the shadow or light from the nose there though. And as mentioned before, shading below the mouth on the chin will be added at times as well. In one illustration I also saw a face contour outline shadow was added too. Now we're moving on to another aspect that can be very unique to each artist, the hair. The hairline art, just like the rest of the line art, has some varying line thickness. It portrays pretty many strands for which the outer strands have thicker, while the inner ones have thinner lines. The lines tend to have a rounded shape here. After the line art, let's talk about the hair shading next. Overall, you have none or just very few shadows, which would mostly be at the hair part. You basically have just one shadow, and a colored border can be added in a few cases as well. In one illustration, more detailed shading for the hair was used. This would also be the illustration where more detailed eye shading was drawn in. Here are the layers I would use to replicate this hair shading. First we'd have the base, next would be the shadows. Highlights would be on an optional layer. They are also added in a few cases. And when it comes to hair, that's over the face or eyes. The eyes are not visible underneath the hair here. After the hair, let's move on to the clothes next. The clothes have thicker lines for silhouettes and thinner lines for folds. Many folds are portrayed with thinner lines. In some cases they will also be portrayed through shading. The fold lines here are often not complete. They tend to be straight, curved, rounded or triangular. The outfits Miuli draws are rather simple. You don't have too many accessories that are added in, which makes sense when you keep in mind that she draws comics where the focus is on the storytelling and not making each image very detailed and rendered. Next, let's move on to the colors Miuli tends to use in her illustrations. These are not too tinted in one color generally, often they're dependent on the lighting. She can use more or less saturated colors or contrast. The lines and black shapes tend to portray most contrast here. Overall, the colors have a reddish tint and are often warm. For shading, Miuli makes use of mostly cell shading, meaning you have clear shadow shapes. In some illustrations, shadow transitions are added by blending a few edges, and in a few of the illustrations, even more painterly shading is used. Often the shading is very simple. You, for example, only have shadows underneath the chin, one general shadow or lighting layer or a shadow or lighting gradient. For the more detailed illustrations, you also have a general shadow layer over everything or a basic gradient, and then additional shadow or light layers can be added. Often Miuli will also use a lighting outline around the character. Miuli also made this chart where she showed different lighting scenarios and how she would paint them. Layers I would use for creating a shading result similar to her illustrations would be first the base layer, next a shadow layer, then another darker shadow layer, and finally a layer for reflected light. But in other cases you could replace this with, for example, just a base and one lighting or one shadow layer. What stands out about the lighting scenarios used would be that often it fits to the overall composition and story of the illustration. The lighting also often helps to bring attention to the focal point. In some cases, instead of shadows or clothing folds, hatching lines will be used. Depending on the lighting, color and base color used, the shadow colors will be affected. They often tend to be more saturated. The final aspect I'll talk about will be the extra effects and what stands out. First, let's talk about the backgrounds. As backgrounds, Miuli paints detailed scenes for most of her illustrations. For some other ones, she uses more graphic elements, patterns or just flat colors. In some of the more detailed backgrounds, lines are used as well, usually for more detailed perspective, heavy scenes where you, for example, have a building. For more natural, organic scenes, no lines can also be used. At times, an outline will also be added through layer effects. Often, many plants are added in the backgrounds as well. They remind me a bit of Ghibli movie scenes. For backgrounds where patterns are used, these can have a bokeh look to them with many dots or circles. It often also looks like a texture is added here. As effects, small sparkles, especially to show magic, fire or lighting, can be added as well. With that, we've gone through all the elements. Next, I talk about my experience of drawing an illustration of my OC Yumari in Miyuli's art style. With this illustration, I like to test if I'm able to apply what I learned through the analysis using my own illustration workflow. We start with the sketch. I wanted to draw my character with a front-on perspective. The body was facing to the left while the head was facing the right. I also wanted to include a hand in the pose here. When drawing the head, a difference I noticed compared to how I normally draw the head would be that the upper part of the head is smaller. This leads to a less anime-like and more cartoony look to me. It's similar with the hair. This has less volume than it does for the characters I tend to draw. For the expression, I also thought about making the mouth open, but this didn't fit that well to the more calm personality Yumari has. For the hand, I made it wider than how I would usually draw it. It's similar with the body. For Yumari's outfit, I kept it pretty close to the original. I only added some accessoires to the hands and ears here, since Miyuli keeps the accessoires and outfits she draws more simple. Next, for the lanyard, I made sure to make the face outline, parts of the hair lanyard, and overall silhouette thicker, while keeping inner lines, for example, the facial features thinner. I wanted to keep the lanyard more on the loose side in this illustration. I also added small fold lines at the shoulders of Yumari's shirt. For coloring, I first just filled them in using Yumari's initial palette, then I decided to use the shading setup Miyuli labeled as her favorite in the shading studies she did for one of her Instagram posts. It has blue overcast light as well as some backlight. I used this as a guide for picking new colors. I also used the shading system I determined from my one shading study of Miyuli's art here. I added a blue background to have it match more to my shading reference, and like this I was ready to move on to shading. I started with the skin, and the colors here looked very extreme to me at first, probably because I'm not used to drawing with shading like this. I also think I could have added more saturation or color variation here. I adjusted the overall coloring later on as well, but first I shaded the rest of the character. While I did talk a lot about cell shading during the analysis part of this video, I used a lot of painterly shading here. Similarly to the shading reference I used, Miyuli can do both cell and painterly shading, and since this was a more detailed illustration than the basic body, for example, I wanted to focus more on a painterly drawing approach here, because I also went with a similar drawing process to what I usually do. Whether you get more of a cell shading or painterly result in the end depends a lot on whether I use more lasso selection shapes or more brush strokes. Do you like to use the lasso tool completely, partly, or do you only use brush strokes for shading? You can let me know in the comments. For the shading here, I made sure to include a lot of blue reflected light from the background. Speaking of which, after the shading, let's move on to this next. I had blocked in some simple clouds and stars as idea for the background during the sketching phase, and here I just filled this in. I experimented a bit with the values since I didn't want it to blend in with Yumari. I made the area around Yumari's head be darker here because of this. Then I added various stars and sparkles in a circular way around Yumari, and like this, we're done? No, not really, because I was not too happy with how the colors and the face looked here. To fix this, I went through these steps. First some color adjustments, through which I added a lot of saturation. Next I went into Clip Studio Paint to try adding some asset brushes. Like this, I added more texture to the background. Back in Krita, I then finally adjusted the proportions and colors again, and while I still see things I would like to improve on, I decided that this illustration was done. Sometimes you just have to move on to something new to learn more, instead of trying to perfect that one illustration you've already spent a lot of time on, and you can always pay attention to what you learned from your previous illustrations for this. And that will be what I'll talk about in a moment. But first I mentioned some of the differences I noticed when comparing my art to Miyuli's art. For one, the line art could have more varying line thickness. Yumari's hand also has too many changes of direction. The lines don't look as smooth as for many of Miyuli's illustrations. Next we move on to my learnings. First would be the importance of storytelling in illustrations. While having a very pretty, detailed aesthetic character can make an illustration stand out, all of that is not necessary and can even feel lifeless when you don't have a good idea and story you want to tell in your illustration. Having characters that interact, using composition and lighting to frame this, can enhance any illustration. Next would be drawing more attention to the characters by using thicker, darker outlines around them, while the background either has colored or no outlines. And finally, we have experimenting with multiple ways of using shading, whether that's cell shading, a simple gradient, hatching lines, or painterly shadows. All of these methods can be used, and I personally want to think more about this instead of just using the painterly shadows mixed with the cell shadows I usually use. And that's all I have to say about this. If you haven't checked out Miyuli's art yet, there will be some links in the video description to this. And if you're interested in reading some of Miyuli's comics, you can find them on Webtoon. She also has a Patreon where she, for example, shares some of her work in progress images. Speaking of Patreon, if you're interested in seeing the full screen recorded process for the basic body I drew in this video, as some other process videos and full resolution versions of my artwork, you can also check out my own Patreon. I hope the video was helpful to you. Thank you for watching, and bye!